Pozdravujem všetkých divákov a poslucháčov. Stáva sa nám to druhýkrát v histórii. Toto sú jedny z posledných slov, ktoré budete dnes v tomto podcaste počuť v slovenčine. A o chvíľu prepnem do angličtiny, keďže môjim dnešným hostom je doktor Kristian Niemietz, ktorý je tu na pozvanie Inesu, ktorí dnes snímajú diskusiu v Palfiho paláci, takže záznam bude možno k dispozícii. So Kristian, thank you for being here. This is our second interview. We've been having one 5 years ago or 4 years ago before the pandemic has arisen, and it was about
just before the pandemic.
It was very
I had no idea that this was going to be my last trip abroad for quite some time.
Was it? Yeah. So 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, when you was here, it was your last trip before pandemic.
That's right. Yeah.
And then you stayed 4 years in UK and we're not moving.
Well, not exactly 4 years, but pretty much the whole of lockdown and the sort of semi-lockdown we had then. So I think the next trip was 1.5 years later, but still with these massive restrictions where you had to show all sorts of certifications and register with the health department of wherever you were going and so on.
Yeah, just to mention, Kristian is originally from Germany, but is living in the UK for how many years?
Since 2007.
It's almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So basically the topic of today's discussion is the NHS and the healthcare system in the United Kingdom. What came to my mind when I was preparing for this interview was that this is very pro-etatist system, sort of very centrally planned, massively state-owned. But before we go to this topic, one of my role models in the politics is Margaret Thatcher. So the NHS, correct me if I remember it incorrectly, was established back in 1948, something like that.
Right, yes.
And when Margaret Thatcher was reigning, it was typical for her that she was very free market, very pro-capitalism oriented, and she was also changing the thinking of the British people towards capitalism as such and towards global market, free trade, etc., etc. But it appears that this kind of thinking was not affecting the healthcare in Britain at all. Am I
That's
wrong?
Exactly right, yes.
How is it possible, and how did it happen? If you think about the past, about really this era of Margaret Thatcher in the United States, it was Ronald Reagan, and they've been all fighting against communism, socialism, and at the end, for a few years, they won this fight. But NHS and the healthcare system in Britain was not influenced, or was it influenced by this thinking?
No, not at all. If anything, there was a counter-reaction that in the 80s you had the rise of conspiracy theories, that there was a secret plan to privatize the NHS, which there never was. But this is something that keeps coming back again and again. At least once a year, some influential group throws up this idea. The government has a secret plan to privatize the NHS, and then you get a moral panic breaking out. And this happens now with, for example, in the context of the trade deal with the US, you get campaigners saying this is a Trojan horse. They're trying to sell the NHS to Donald Trump. And this was already a thing last time.
Whole NHS.
Yes.
As it is.
Yes. It has absolutely nothing to do with the trade deal, of course. But this is just something that's been ongoing since the 1980s. Because you had, the Thatcher government obviously privatized lots of other things. And it wasn't clear right from the start what exactly that would include. It's not that they had a shopping list saying this is what we want to privatize, this is what we won't privatize. It's more, it was an agenda that developed as it went on. Started with some smaller things, so social housing, council housing, that was less controversial, and then moved to bigger companies and the controversial things like the railways, electricity, that happened much later. And it wasn't clear right from the start that it wouldn't include healthcare. Now, looking back, we now know, of course, that there was never a serious plan to include healthcare in this. But it wasn't so clear from the perspective, I guess, of an outside observer. It was not entirely absurd to speculate about this, that maybe one day they will include the National Health Service in this. And that would, of course, have been the most controversial of them all. It was, in fact, it would have been so controversial that even for Thatcher, it was just inconceivable. So it's quite possible that that she would secretly have some sympathies with the idea, But even though she was a radical reformer, she picked her battles wisely. She picked battles that she could win, and even then, not always, because we know that in the end she was forced out in 1990. But nonetheless, up until that point, she was politically shrewd. She knew she had a feeling for which political battles she could win and which she couldn't. And she knew that by the time she became Prime Minister in 1979, the National Health Service had become a national religion. She knew exactly, if I touch that thing, I'll be out. And that's why it didn't happen.
How did it become the national religion, and why? Because if we take a look on the comparison of the various healthcare systems all across the world, but let's stay in Europe, and if we compare it with other systems, totally different systems, the effectivity and cost-benefit systems are some other system that you are also mentioning in your book, such as Switzerland or Netherlands. So it is a national treasure, national religion. But if you would have to describe how NHS works and what's wrong with it, what would be your answer? If we are comparing, for example, with Slovakia, we have the system of the health insurance companies who do not have so good opportunity to run a competition between each other, but it is still a different system. So what's NHS and how it works?
Well, it essentially means that the whole of the healthcare system is nationalized. It's run like a nationalized industry. It's a public service which gets a certain amount of money every year allocated by the government. Right now it's about £200 billion, and with that money, it provides the full range of services. It buys a little bit. So there is some private sector involvement at the margin, but it's very little compared to pretty much any other healthcare system. It's something like 10% or so of the budget. Most healthcare is just provided in-house by the NHS itself. And what's wrong with that is just what's wrong with any nationalized industry. It means that you, as a consumer, you don't have a lot of choice, and to the extent that you can choose within it, it doesn't have the same consequences that it would in the marketplace, where your choices can make or break a company depending on the choices that consumers make. You can have a big company losing market share, going bankrupt even, some newcomer starting from nothing, suddenly becoming a big thing. That couldn't happen in that kind of healthcare system.
So in Great Britain, there is no insurance companies?
There are, but very few people have them. So you can have that on top of the NHS. The NHS is a universal system. It's there for everybody. And for
everybody who is employed or who's working in the United Kingdom, plus who was born in UK, right?
Well, every legal resident.
Okay.
But even if you're not a legal resident, it's unlikely that they would turn you away. So that's why another issue, it's not the biggest problem they have, but one of the minor issues that they also have is the issue of health tourism, that you have people coming and then they get sick, and it can be totally unplanned, and usually is. And normally elsewhere in Europe, this would just be, that's what the European health insurance card is for, that the healthcare provider would then send a bill to that person's health insurance company. The NHS could in principle do that too. It's just not good at it, at keeping track of things. But yeah, so every legal resident and in practice, then not
it's
so
entitled
legal
for universal healthcare.
Yes. You can also have private insurance on top, but only about 10% of the population have that. And the issue with that is that if you want to have private insurance, you have to effectively pay twice. You first pay for the NHS through your tax money, and then you pay directly for your private insurance. And then there's also the fact that private insurance, so far at least, has only been a luxury segment.
But what is those companies who are providing the insurance? Well, they are insuring, because if you have a universal healthcare system and you just pay the taxes and you do not pay nothing on top, so what do have to be insured?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's why that is usually just a luxury segment where they offer
have a better accommodation,
places.
Or
Yes, it's things like that. Yeah, but you can be seen more quickly, because the NHS, one of its ongoing problems is the issue of long waiting lists.
It is,
and the private insurers would tell you, well, if you sign up here, we'll get you seen much more quickly, and then some NHS estates are also pretty run down, not very pleasant places to be, and the private ones are much more like hotels, basically, so that they offer a higher standard. But that's basically it. That's why there is so little of it. It's just difficult to compete with somebody who can offer things for free, at least free at a point of use.
Who owns, for example, hospitals, ambulances, etc., etc.? Is it state-owned or the regions own it?
All part of the NHS. And
so all of them are state-owned?
Yes.
All of them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's imagine that I'm an investor and I want to build a hospital. Can I or can I not? Or can I?
It's not against the law. You can. Well, okay. You need to get planning permission. That's another issue. That's another thing that that Britain is terrible at. That nothing gets built. But let's say you get planning permission to build it. You can have that. It's just that in order to attract customers. Again, the issue is they have to pay twice. They have already paid for an NHS healthcare through their taxes, and you have to tell them, leave that alone, even though you're entitled to it, come to me and pay all of that directly.
So it is a circle that investors, basically, it is very challenging to enter the market with the new provider of the hospital, anything, because only state-owned hospitals exist, but people don't want to go to some different hospital, or there is no motivation for the investor to build a hospital, etc., and competing with the other hospitals.
There are a few. It's just a very tiny proportion of the overall healthcare sector. And it's growing a bit now because we've had this issue with waiting times exploding during the pandemic and not really coming down very much. So there's more than 6 million people on a waiting list, or in some cases more than one waiting list, and that's something like 1/10 of the population. Some of these people are now either going for private insurance or they just pay directly for on a one-off basis for one treatment. So there's been a little bit of growth in the private sector, but so far that's been very marginal. So that's why you can more or less use the NHS and the healthcare system synonymously, even though it's not entirely true. There are a few private hospitals, but so far it's been so little you could basically neglect it.
In Slovakia, there are many problems and challenges in healthcare, but quite a lot of people from Slovakia work in the UK and live in the UK, and it is very common for them to fly from wherever in Britain back to Slovakia to have the access to the healthcare.
Yeah.
Especially because of the waiting list. Back in 2016, you wrote the book Universal Healthcare Without NHS, towards a patient-centered system. What's the core of the book, and what's the core of the criticism that you are providing in this book?
Well, I was essentially making the case for a competitive social insurance system. And by that, I don't just mean an old-school Bismarck-type system of the German variety, because the problem with that kind of system was historically you had systems with multiple insurers, but they couldn't really. There wasn't really any variation, so they all pretty much did the same thing because they had so little autonomy. And I was looking around at social insurance systems that had liberalized, either in recent years or that had just a more liberal tradition, like in Switzerland. That had always been fairly liberal. In the Netherlands, they had 10 years before the book came out, a series of interesting reforms where they just gave health insurers greater freedoms to arrange contracts with healthcare providers in different ways. So you had more market-based, more liberal social insurance systems emerging. And I said, well, ideally, this is the way healthcare should be organized. So when you have a system like that, you still have universal coverage, but you also get all the good bits of the market economy. And that is why I wasn't just saying switch to social insurance, because social insurance obviously already exists, and I don't know enough about the system in this country to comment on whether it's good or bad.
Our one?
Yeah.
Very similar to, I think, any other system of the social insurance. It cannot last because you're run out of the money. For example, our social insurance company, it's just one state-owned, and it's in debt of 3 billion per year. So, in the UK healthcare, that's your quote. In UK healthcare, debate is stuck in a false dichotomy. Either you support the NHS or you support the US model. But nearly every developed country provides universal healthcare without copying the NHS or the US system. And also, you argue that NHS is not the only nor the best way to achieve the universal healthcare. So, what's the public opinion towards this type of thinking?
Well, at the time, that was extremely controversial. So,
really?
I received lots of Twitter hatred and
for this?
Partly for this and for other papers that I wrote on the same subject. It was just, at the time, if you said something NHS critical, you would be the absolute, you would be a public enemy. You would just have a hate
and you
mob
enjoy
coming. Well, a little bit, yeah. But I also do want to make a serious point. But if that goes together with a bit of a Twitter battle, then I'll take that as a good combination.
Since 2016 or during the COVID era, a lot of national healthcare system, the government were really putting a lot of money, much more money than they used to healthcare system. What's the situation in the UK? Is there a problem with funding, or is there more of the problem of the waiting list and the patients cannot get the treatment that they need?
Yeah, so historically it was true that the NHS was a fairly Spartan system because you had the budget directly controlled by the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, and if they said, well, it's only going to be so and so many billion, then that was it. And healthcare providers were then not able to say, oh, but we want to offer additional treatments and we want to offer extras and whatever. They were just not able to do that. They had their budget, they had to work with it. So therefore, you could say historically, maybe there was some truth in the idea that if you just give it more money, maybe things would improve. But that's actually quite a long time ago. So Tony Blair then, the new Labour government after 1997, they had this pledge in 2000, we will raise healthcare spending to the European average, and they did that quite quickly. So in the Blair years, the budget used to grow in real terms by 6, 7, 8% every year. And then after the financial crisis, that quite abruptly stopped. So this endless series of very large year-on-year increases. From then on, the healthcare budget was kept constant, roughly in per capita and age-adjusted terms. So it was only increased in line with the cost pressures that you can explain by demographic changes and, of course, inflation, population growth, so that it effectively was just capped and grew very slightly from then on. And but towards the end of the decade, so even before the pandemic, that was reversed again. Then you saw another round of big spending increases, and then with the pandemic, there you had a big explosion, which was never really reversed. So now Britain is actually in the global top 10 when it comes to healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP. And the idea that the system is underfunded, this is something that defenders of the system will always bring up. And in the 1980s, okay, maybe they had a bit of a point, that they could have argued that in the 90s as well. But that's really something that's a historic leftover argument now. It really no longer applies to this day and age.
NHS is also in Slovakia, but I guess especially in the United Kingdom, that people said it is for free. Yeah, do you get everything for free? I don't know how the taxes is part of the free, and I never understood that. But so it's not free because you're paying taxes. And what do you get for it?
In theory, everything, or at least the full range of services. So from primary care to hospital care to pharmaceutical specialist care. But one problem with it is that there is no, so unlike in an insurance system where you have a contract with the insurance company and you know what is covered and what isn't, it's not quite like that on the NHS. So there is no lists that you can download.
Same in Slovakia.
No? No?
Basically, because we are also telling that everything is insured, despite the fact that it's a lie. But please, go on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so one of the problems there is that there isn't a specific treatment where you can say, okay, I'm entitled to this or I'm not entitled to this. You wouldn't know. That is just an ad hoc decision that is made by the NHS funding bodies. Can vary from place to place. Also, there's some variation across the country, but in a fairly unsystematic manner, where they would just say, we will cover this treatment or we don't. But that is not something that you can directly see or influence. So you are entitled to whatever the healthcare authorities in your area deem fit and proper and are prepared to fund. Of course, if you are then stuck on a waiting list, and for some people, I mean, waiting lists, there's always some waiting.
Of course.
It wouldn't be, it would be strange if everybody was seen within 5 minutes. But when we're talking about waiting lists, we're really talking about people who can be, in some cases, more than a year waiting for treatment, or especially in the accident and emergency department. Not unheard of that people spend 24 hours there. And if the system is rationed in that way, then all these free entitlements on paper don't help you very much. But that's always the case with things that are supposedly offered for free. Of course, it has to be limited in some way, and that just happens through rationing.
You're also criticizing the accessibility of the healthcare, and massively criticizing also the central planning in your papers and in your book as well. What is the side effect or the main effect that is the central planning in the healthcare causing in Britain?
Well, it just means if you look at a more liberal social insurance system like in the Netherlands, there you can have people can come up with a new idea of organizing a clinical service and they can just do it. Or a health insurer can offer a different kind of plan where, say, they offer some incentive system for you to, say, use a more low-cost version of something first. Or Switzerland would probably be a better example here. Mm-hmm. They have this option where you can have... There is an insurance option where you get a discount. The insurance premium is cheaper if you agree that you will have telephone consultations first. And so then you're talking to somebody who is medically qualified to assess your symptoms from a distance, and then they tell you, okay, you need to go there or there. And rather than you just going somewhere, and it might be the wrong place, and you might consume healthcare resources unnecessarily. And you just have that option to set up a model like that, and people don't have to choose it if you don't want to do things that way. You don't need to, but the option is there, and you can get the discount if you want to. You get this kind of market discovery process where you can just try different things, and let's see, some things work for some people, not for others. Whereas in an NHS type system, something like that can only be done if there's a political decision. So if you want to set up a model like that, you would have to convince the health secretary or a political party or just some political decision maker. It's not something that the healthcare system can generate on its own.
In general, are people in Britain satisfied with how NHS works?
So there are surveys on this, and right now the results are pretty abysmal. It started to decline about 2 years ago because of this explosion in waiting lists, where you had for the first time in possibly ever far more people saying I'm dissatisfied than people saying I'm satisfied.
Well, more people are dissatisfied.
Yes. That is what the surveys say. Normally, though, I wouldn't put too much faith in surveys. I think a reason why, so previously, certainly before the pandemic, and say if you go back 20 years or so, you would always have phenomenally high levels of approval. But there's always the problem that the NHS having this sacred cow status, I think that there was also a kind of a social pressure to say, oh yes, everything's great. You were not supposed to say, I'm dissatisfied with the NHS.
But also in your books, you are proclaiming or advocating for replacing of the NHS. Mm-hmm. How that should be done?
Well, I mean, this country has done it. Maybe not as, in the best possible way, but certainly the transition
It used to be
wasn't
much,
the
much
problem.
better, but then we screw up.
Okay.
Very, very successfully.
I need to know more about that. But I mean, talking about the original transition from the old Semashko system to the maybe imperfect social insurance system, but still recognizably a social insurance system. That was done
That's
here in the 90s.
interesting. How would we define NHS? What it would be? It's not Semashko. It's not Atomen. It's Bismarck model.
No, it's it's sometimes described as a beverage model.
Maybe beverage.
Because
Yes,
beverage wrote
yeah.
this report. But even that, I'm not quite sure whether that's completely accurate, because I think beverage didn't envisage a complete takeover of the state. He had this idea that the state would provide a safety net, but not crowd out private initiative completely. And so this could have been implemented in other ways as well. I would just describe it as a nationalized industry. But you could absolutely take the transition path that happened here in the 90s, that you had the old Semashko system and turning that into a social insurance system. And that was not especially disruptive, at least not compared to all the other stuff that was happening at the same time. Why should that not also work in Britain? So you also already have organizations within the NHS that allocate money on behalf of patients. And I'm simply arguing in the book, well, these organizations, they are basically like health insurers. It's just that right now you don't have explicitly a contract with that organization. You wouldn't even know normally that such an organization exists. It's just something that's operating behind the scenes. And I'm saying make that explicit, but also give people the choice. If they're not satisfied with their health insurer, whatever else you want to call it, give them the choice to either choose a different one of the ones that are currently part of the NHS, or opt out of that system completely and go for a completely private one.
Basically, people want a few things from the healthcare system. The trouble is that, as far as I know, or as I like to mention it, people want free things from the healthcare, to be free, with good quality, and for everybody and accessible. The trouble is that you can have just two of those. So NHS is basically a state monopoly, and the people who are advocating for those systems says that that healthcare should be universal and for everybody. So what would be the counter argument towards those people who are advocating for that in order to achieve the different system, not state-owned or state-run?
Yeah, well, I'd simply say compare the results. It is quite clear that if we look at measures like avoidable deaths, the rates of avoidable deaths that could have been prevented through better healthcare, if we look at cancer survival rates, stroke, heart attack survival rates, the NHS is quite clearly behind most Western European systems, and certainly behind the system that I'm most often comparing it to, which is the Eindhoven model, the Dutch model, yes, which is a fairly liberal, market-based social insurance model. And I'd say that is the way to go.
When we are speaking about any other industry, any other airlines, metallurgy, I don't know, whatever, people are saying, yeah, the company should have a profit. But when we are speaking about the healthcare, it's like people get totally crazy and they're saying that there cannot be a profit in the healthcare. I never understood why shouldn't there be a profit in healthcare, because every euro that you spend ends up in the profit of somebody. Mm-hmm. But you would have to explain or answer that to those people who are telling that healthcare, there should not be profits in the healthcare. What would be your reply?
Well, I would say, yes, okay, the argument is always it's immoral to profit from the sickness of other people, but then you could also say the baker profits from other people's hunger. It's the same thing, you satisfy a need, and if you do that well, if you do that in such a way that people want to come back to you and recommend you, why shouldn't you make a profit? But then I would also say, if people have this emotional aversion to profit seeking, I think it's irrational. But if we take that as given for a moment, it is possible, of course, to have a market-based healthcare system with a lot of non-profit organizations. That is not uncommon. In the Netherlands, most healthcare providers and even health insurers are operated on a non-profit basis. You can set up a for-profit insurer. It's just that since the system has historically evolved mostly on a non-profit basis, that's relatively less common. But even in the United States, non-profit organizations actually dominate. In practice, they don't behave that differently from for-profit organizations. But if that is, say, a hard limit for some people, then I would say, well, if that matters so much to you, look up the legal form of the company before you go there and go and choose a non-profit one if that's what you want. And I'm sure that would be provided in a market system.
But I do not see any irrationality for fighting against profit. Because in Slovakia, our problem is that a lot of people are fighting against profit, but almost nobody is fighting against loss. It's like we have changed the morality. Those who make money, those who are in good numbers, those are the bad guys, and those who are losing the money, these are the moral guys who you should do it like that. But I do not see any improvement in explaining to people that this is just crazy. Like it cannot be, it cannot last like that for too many years.
No, it should really be a profit, or if it's a non-profit organization, say a surplus, should really just be seen as an indication you're doing something right. You are creating value, and that value is greater than the cost of whatever you're doing. And it's a signal, keep doing what you do. Now, you could, of course, argue that if you have in any sector, if you have abnormally high profits, and that persists year after year after year, then I too would wonder, what's going on there? Because normally what happens if profit rates are very high, somebody would enter that industry.
Yes,
right?
that would be my next question. When the profits are too high, I don't know what's too high profit. I don't understand what's too high. It's but the market would be signaling that there are a lot of good opportunities to earn money. So the other companies would like to enter the market. The problem of all of the healthcare system is their sustainability, because Europe in general is getting old. We have more and more people who are going to be retired or are already retiring or retired. Plus, we are living longer and longer. So, you would have to compare the system, but we focus on NHS. Can we say that in the current model, the NHS system is not sustainable?
It depends on what you mean by that. So you certainly get increasing cost pressures.
Definitely.
And there is just little political willingness to do anything about that. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that the system is somehow going to hit. So when you describe something as unsustainable, that sounds like at some point it's going to hit a wall, and then the system will either disappear, dissolve.
It won't disappear.
It will always be there in some form. But what you will get is just even more brutal rationing.
Based on the current situation in Great Britain, do you see any chance on the Labour Party, or based on the policies of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, that there will be some significant changes of how NHS works, or it's not the topic of the day?
About a year ago, so we had the new Labour government coming in, and the current health secretary actually tried to present himself as a bit of a reformer. For example, before he became health secretary, before they won the election, he went on a trip to Australia and Singapore, because he said he called that a fact-finding mission. He wanted to find out about their healthcare systems. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal. That doesn't sound like something revolutionary. Obviously, politicians want to learn a bit from international experience and whatever their area is. But,
or have a nice trip.
Or I guess in his case, it was mostly photo opportunities and so forth. But nonetheless, in British healthcare, that was almost a revolutionary statement, because that wouldn't happen before. So you can have a politician in some other area, say education minister, they could do that. They could say, I want to learn a bit from the Swedish education system or whatever. But in healthcare, that normally wouldn't happen, because that would already come with an admission. There are other healthcare systems, maybe some are better, who knows? That was not something you were supposed to say. By making that trip, even if it was mostly just to have a nice trip, that was almost a revolutionary statement at the time.
But people are still persuaded that NHS system is the best, despite the results in efficiency, maybe also in life expectancy, etc., etc. It's like really, then it's religious, because you cannot take a look on the data at all.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. So I've tried that. You normally don't get very far. But going back to your question, so he did that initially, and that was some commentators thought, okay, there's something different about this guy. Maybe this signals a willingness that previous governments, previous politicians didn't have. And maybe that was even real for a while. It's just that now they're retreating into their comfort zone. So there was one opposition politician who mentioned the possibility of insurance systems, and we had local elections recently. So it wasn't even, local elections have nothing to do with healthcare. It's all national level policy. But nonetheless, the Labour government used that as a weapon to attack opposition parties, saying if you vote for these guys, you will get an insurance system, and how terrible would that be? So they are back to their old, this system is the best, this is what makes us a civilized country, everything else would be hell, everything else would be, you would die in the streets. And this is the kind of rhetoric. He briefly distanced himself from that and said, no, I'm going to be different. I'm taking these trips. I say uncomfortable things every now and then. But now he's retreated into the comfort zone. So there you can see we're not there yet.
One of the more interesting maybe for me and for our listeners, that the Britons started to work on a project Pharmacy First. That they've been paying a lot of attention of the weight of the patient. That people should go to see a pharmacist first, and then to visit hospital. Was this program more of the necessity, or it was well run? Planned how to reduce, for example, the number of the visits of the doctors by patients?
I don't know enough about that program, but if so, yes, it's probably a mix of both. So you obviously have this massive waiting list, and it should come down, and it kind of does, but it's so slow, you can barely see it in the numbers. So any kind of diversion technique will do. And what you also get more commonly in a situation like that is that politicians will just talk about public health measures. They will say, oh, well, forget about the healthcare service for a while. It's all about getting people to exercise. It's all about getting people to stop smoking and to stop eating chocolate bars or whatever. But what they do in those ways is, these are just diversion tactics. These are ways of saying, leave the healthcare system alone. That's too difficult. We won't touch that. We'll place the blame somewhere else. And in the same way, you get sometimes they come up with this idea: we will just digitalize things, and then it will all be well. And this sounds like just another one of those measures.
Usually when the system is in problem, there is some hacks that companies or the people are trying to find a way how to get a healthcare. Also, because of the so long waiting list, the phenomenon of telemedicine has rise in Britain. But is this rise caused by the waiting list or by, let's say, progressivism? In the medicine, that people maybe do not see or don't need to see the doctor face to face all the time?
Yes, so I'd say if we had a more market-based system, so in Switzerland they've always had this option where that's what I mentioned, the telemedicine model, where that is just an insurance option which you can opt into. You don't have to, but you can do it. And the offer is there, and people can then ask themselves, am I prepared to pay a bit more and to have that face-to-face guaranteed contact, or am I okay with using this more distance, technology-based form of consultation first? Britain has gone from one extreme to the other. That for a while that was barely a thing at all, and then suddenly it was almost the default option. That now that's basically what they will do. They will tell you, let's do telemedicine, let's have a phone consultation, and it's just hard to get through to anyone. And I'd say neither is ideal. You should neither restrict that option too much, nor should you try to force it on everybody. It should just be there as an option. And if it does lead to cost savings, then share the cost savings with the patients and then let them make the choice. So I'm not in the business of saying telemedicine is good or it's bad, or it should be 30% of all consultations or 60% or 53.2%. I mean, that would be central planning. I don't want to make those decisions. I just want a framework in which people can make different choices, and where if some choices lead to cost savings, where there is the possibility to share that with people so that there is a financial incentive to do it, and then in that way work out what people actually want and what makes sense to provide.
The very last question. You would have to predict in 5 years, is there going to be any paradigmatical change regarding the NHS and how it works or not?
Well, what I've noticed, having written about this topic for more than 10 years now, is that, as I said initially, when my first papers and the book, when they came out, I was pretty much the only one, and that was really not a crowded field. Now, my position is far less exotic. So it is still a minority position, but it is something that you can sometimes read in a mainstream newspaper. That would not happen, say, 4 years ago. The last time we had the interview, I would not have predicted that. So things have moved. Nonetheless, I wouldn't say that in 5 years' time you will see political change. It's still, there is a change in the debate around it, in so far that opinions that used to be completely beyond the pale, something that you absolutely couldn't say in public, are now sayable, are now more acceptable, still a bit fringe, but sort of just about within the bounds of respectability. And if there has been so much progress in just 5 years or less, in fact, then why not go further in that direction? So some things, sometimes good things do happen.
So we'll talk about it in 5 years.
Absolutely. Hopefully this time not interrupted by a pandemic.
Dr. Niemietz, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.